Hello everybody and welcome to my February wrap-up. Still doing really well in February. I read 6 books. Let's talk about everything I read in February. The first book that I read was The Secret Commonwealth by Philip Pullman. This is the second book in his Book of Dust series, and it's listed as he calls it like an equel to his Dark Materials trilogy, because there are stories that take place before the starts of his Dark Materials. This book takes place after the events of his Dark Materials. I loved it. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I mean, I really love Philip Pullman's writing. What I have read from him, I have always pretty much thoroughly enjoyed. And of course, I love the world of his Dark Materials. So being back in it, it's like this really strange nostalgia trip while also being given a new story. So I don't know what to expect. And I liked seeing kind of where Lyra is in the future and how she has evolved and matured over some time. I read the Enchanted Sonata by Heather Dixon Walwork. I realized I'd never actually learned the author's name when I read the book. This was a book that sat in my TBR as an ARC for a really, really, really long time. I picked it because it was supposed to be some kind of nutcracker retelling of sorts. Kind of wasn't. I gave it 3 stars. It was okay. It just kind of wasn't what I expected. And while there were moments where the writing was nice, it wasn't so much that, I loved it. I guess I'm just never really going to get a nutcracker retelling that I like. I read Buried in the Sky, The Extraordinary Story of the Sherpa Climbers on K2's Deadliest Day by Peter Zuckerman and Amanda Padoan. Really hope I said her name correctly. This and another book that I read that was called The Summit, How Triumph Turned to Tragedy on K2's Deadliest Days by Pat Falvey. These are both about the 2008 K2 incident in which a whole bunch of climbers were essentially stranded up in the summit area, in the death zone really of K2 due to some issues. And especially Buried in the Sky really gave you the story of the Sherpas and the HAPs, the high altitude porters who were involved. There was one particular Sherpa who was there for days in the death zone, and just because he was kind of coordinating the rescue efforts. Really impressive story about some really extraordinary people, and in some cases some people where you go, that was a really dumb decision. I particularly like The Summit because there was a guy who, I think his name was Jerry McDonald or something like that. He was the first Irishman to summit K2. There was photographic evidence of it happening, and there was a lot of conflicting accounts of what happened to him, because a lot of the problem is when you've been up in the death zone for that long without bottled oxygen, you start going into hypoxia, your brain is deprived of oxygen, and everybody was sort of spread out. Nobody really knew what was happening to each other, so there were a lot of conflicting accounts of things that happened. But it became clear that Jer not only happened to find the Korean climbing team and some of their, and I think 1 or 2 of their HAPs or Sherpas. I'm honestly not entirely sure which of the 2. I know there is a serious distinction. I'm kind of remembering from vague memory details here. That he saw that they were in trouble because they were literally tangled up together and hanging down. And he started climbing back up the mountain to get a better look and actually managed to cut them free to help them, and later was killed by some ice that fell. So he died in the attempt of saving them. He did save them, but it cost him his life. And it's sort of wow, that's a really heroic thing to do, because it was actually the Summit, which was a documentary that I'd seen on the 2008 disaster. It and the book are pretty much tied together, and that's where I heard the story of if trying to save somebody on the mountain is going to do deadly harm to yourself, you just sort of abandon them on the mountain. And Jer never felt right doing that. There's a couple stories that are told of him rescuing people when he didn't need to and when it could have cost him. So anyway, rated both those 5 out of 5 stars. They're very good books. Again, I have a thing about morbid topics, I guess. I listened to Caffeine, How Caffeine Created the Modern World by Michael Pollan. He's known for writing a handful of books about food and culture. I gave it 4 stars. It was definitely interesting, but by the end of it, I was sort of you can pry my coffee from my cold dead hands. I love it. Go away. I've gone cold turkey. I hated it. Bite me. But it was a good book. It was a good, easy listen from Audible. I think I got it as like a free listen from that month or something. And finally, I read Regeneration by Pat Barker. I also watched the film adaptation of this as well. It's available on Amazon Prime. So if you have that, I do recommend it. This is a story that's set in World War One, which is a particular time period I'm very interested in. Fun fact, I find World War One more interesting than World War Two, which is not the norm for a lot of Americans because we weren't really involved in World War One. World War One is really Europe's war. Because the US didn't even get involved in World War One until like the last year of the war, and like sure, we got shredded pretty bad in that last year, but nothing compared to Europe. I think the statistics are still that Britain, France, and Italy lost more or had more casualties in World War One than they did in World War Two. And World War One fascinates me because it's the birth of modern warfare. I mean, at the beginning of the war, you still had armies with like horse cavalries and like big brightly colored decorative uniforms, and by the end of it, it's like everybody had worked really hard to develop more modern ways of like killing each other in mass quantities. So by the end, you know, you have tanks and artillery, you have machine guns, you have air forces, you have, you know, I mean, there were already navies, but they were brought even more up to date, including undersea boats, grenades. Just so much of that war was all about modernizing and finding the most effective and horrifying ways to kill each other. It's a war that I don't think gets enough attention in the US, again, because we're all into American exceptionalism and we love World War II because, like, hey, it was personal. We got involved. But anyway, World War I find fascinating. This is a book that's set in World War I. It is a obviously historical fiction story, but several of the characters in this were real people. You have two of the greatest World War I era poets, Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owens, and I highly recommend the poems of Wilfred Owens if you haven't read them. It's some of the most devastating poetry, like war poetry you'll read. It's really stunning. And a particular psychiatrist, because it's taking place in a mental hospital where soldiers are gone to be treated for shell shock, essentially, in all the various forms of that, which obviously we now know is PTSD, and then sent back out into battle. Siegfried Sassoon is there because he wrote a pretty scathing argument against the war. He was fighting in it, and then he came to realize, like, this isn't a war of conscience anymore, like, this is murder. And so the army kind of sent him there to basically get deemed insane so they could look at, you know, they could turn to his publication and go like, see, he's crazy. He didn't know what he was talking about. But it's a really, really good book. It's very interesting. The film adaptation is also very good. I was really taken with a good chunk of it. I understand it's part of a series, this book. I don't know if I'll read the series. I was kind of just interested in this one because I'd heard it was good. And particularly because I think the characters of Sassoon and Wilfred Owens and all of them are not involved in the rest of it. I know for a fact Wilfred Owens isn't, because Wilfred Owens, sadly, I mean, he was a real person. He died in combat. So there was that. But yeah, I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. It's a beautiful book. I might do a review on it. And by review, I mean probably rambling about why I like World War I over World War II, and yeah. But now we're into March. I'm definitely reading a book for March right now. We'll see how March goes. Thanks for watching me ramble today. If you'd like to see more from me, go ahead and click that button with my face on it. It'll take you to my channel, where I ramble about a whole lot of different things. Got some thoughts of your own? Go ahead and leave them down in the comments. And make sure that if you want to see more ramblings from me, you click that little subscribe button. That's it for me today, you guys, so until next time. Cheers.